everyone, welcome to the War Room, episode 2 of the MSI coverage 2017. And for those of you who don't know the War Room, this is an analytical show where we go over the matches and we go over aspects we found interesting to look at. And my name is Chakrez. You might know me as a content creator. I work for LolKing, and before that I worked with some teams. And my co-host, Nasser, who is the head analyst for Misfits. And before that, he worked with NRG and some other teams as well. Last week we started with groups. We started with previewing the teams for groups, rather. And now that groups are over, we can finally have another look after all those games and go team by team. And we'll also be doing a preview of how we think the semifinals and perhaps even finals are going to go. Nasser, I believe we wanted to start with WE, correct?
Yeah, I think a WE is a good starting point for the tournament. Mostly because it seems like they were the only non-Korean team, and kind of along with the Marines, that still understood how important mid-priority was. And they understood that drafting strong mid-lane matchups is you're going to aid you so much more in these games versus these stronger international opponents. The other teams like TSM, Flash Wolves, and especially G2 would just forfeit lane by picking scaling champs because they have this faulty logic where they think, hey, we withstood these matchups domestically versus, these worse teams, so we'll be fine at this tournament. But that's not how things turned out. And if you look at all the teams at the event, everyone has a strong mid laner, and everyone has like a good or competent jungler, at least going into the event. But because they've been conditioned domestically that giving away strong mid champions like Syndra consistently is okay, and they can still win domestically, they think that they can just withstand it and withstand the early game pressure and scale up versus these international teams.
All right. And you just mentioned mid priority, and one of the things that actually was very uncharacteristic from some teams for it was yielding it as well, because like Flash Wolves, we know that they play much for mid priority, but WE, I think, for the most part, except for like the initial weeks, they did show comps where they weren't so strong, but I think towards the end they were a team that really remembered what was their style and what they were good at, and
You're talking about Flash Wolves, right?
No. Going back to WE, I think that WE figured out.
Not during the tournament.
No, but like they had. So how do I put this? They had like midway through. They had like this game against TSM where they drafted. Actually, that game is not a good example because they actually drafted pretty good early game, but then they had.
Yeah, I think most of their games, at least like 80% of them, they understood. Really understood like taking that strong mid lane matchup, and at least one strong side lane is going to benefit them a lot, which is surprising because in the LPL they didn't draft consistently towards a strong mid matchups, just towards a strong early game, and they usually go for these Ezreal Kog'Maw comps that we saw teams like G2 do at this tournament. So I was pleasantly surprised. Like, it was one of the reservations I had about this team. And seeing them switch gears and realize that this is not really going to cut it. We need a strong early game because we play so well with the strong early game draft. Really impressed me.
Yeah. Well, what I was getting at was that basically their form was a bit weird in the sense that they started off decent, and then they had like this slump. They were suddenly 3-3, and then they just won their last 4 games, right? So I think they were the team, as you were saying, that figured out that they really needed mid priority, but they still kept drafting, I would say, to their strengths. Because one of the things I noticed was some of the teams drafted differently than they drafted in their region, and WE did that too, but WE was already doing some of that in some of their games in the LPL, is what I mean. So they figured out of their kind of 2 styles. We talked about it last week, how they had like these more early game geared comps, and then they had like these scaling comps. They figured out that they really needed the mid priority. They really needed the early game factors. And I feel like other teams didn't really look at that as much, and even drafted uncharacteristically differently from their usual style, like Flash Wolves. But we'll get into that later.
Yeah. In terms of like WE and their playstyle, when they do get that solid draft, like it doesn't have to be the best draft in the world. It just needs to have mid priority and a good jungler that can pressure the opponent. And when they do that, like we said last week, they're so good at recognizing where they have which lane they have priority, and then not just like continually ganking it. Even though they did that once versus TSM, and that led to a very weird loss. But they use that lane priority to maybe get a gank off once, but usually they try to get deep vision in the enemy jungle and also use that pressure to counter jungle. And it was a really strong tactic versus a lot of these teams that were picking scaling comps.
Yeah, that game versus TSM was actually one where I actually liked their comp. They matched the Kennen with the J. They have the J's top that they had to blind, but overall it kind of matches with the Kennen, so it's fine. And they really had like good setup for pick, right? They had the Ashe and the Elise, which are good pick, and then with the burst from Jace and the burst from mid Karma, because mid Karma has quite some burst. They had a pretty decent pick comp, right? And they started off the game fantastically with the early ganks from Condi bot lane. But then what happens in that game was, so they understood that part, but then Condi has this weird game where he doesn't really farm or do anything. If you look at his pathing, he just stays stuck around bot lane for way too long. And then what they don't understand is that the other side of the map, something's happening too. And I mean, here I actually had a small discussion with Kelsey about this one. I felt like one, bot lane was already like ahead enough where Condi could start playing towards his top side, because top side was going to be the focus for TSM, right? You have a Kennen lane, you want that Kennen lane to be ahead. So either you botch it, and 957 needs to be aware that his lane is going to be the one that gets ganked, so he can't be undeterred against the Lee Sin, because he's going to kick him in and Kennen's going to kill him, right? And so what missed there, I feel like, was when Condi was bot lane, 957 was too pushed up, right? And so when when you're playing towards one side lane, the other one has to back off, even if that means yielding the turret because you rush for first turret.
I don't mind forfeiting the other side of the map, as long as you're getting vision and enemy jungle camps to offset that, so that later on you know exactly where the enemy jungler is going to be, and you can make a play towards bot, around minute 8 to 10, and then get that first blood tower. Or you can also use the pressure bot lane to kind of find an opening in the top lane where the enemy top laner won't have like enough vision, and his jungler isn't going to be there. And because you have deep vision in the enemy jungler bot side, you're gonna know where the jungler is, and if you have that opportunity to gank top. And they did that in other games.
Especially with the bot lane, they had Ashe Nami with an Elise, so it's very easy for them to do what you were saying when top lane's a long lane and Kennen starts pushing in, to punish him with CC, because you have enough initiation from afar to do so. But yeah, I just felt that that game was like a game where I looked at the draft and I was like, okay, the Jace is a bit iffy, but they had to get a blind pick, and the Kennen was still open. And the rest of the draft, I like it, and it's something that looks like WE a lot, like with the Elise, with the Ashe, with the Karma. And then they just like executed really poorly, but I think they started, as the tournament went on, they started executing better and better, and that culminated with their win over SKT in the last week.
Yeah, for me, WE certainly exceeded mine and a lot of people's expectations.
Yeah.
They figured out their strengths, and they executed their early game and mid game very, very well to be able to close out these games. One weakness, though, is that during their like a couple of their losses, they were a bit too trigger happy. And by that I mean once they had this lead, instead of setting up around objectives or setting up waves, they kind of want to skirmish or fight real fast, or maybe try to go for a quick Baron. And we saw in their first game versus SKT that it almost paid off, but Peanut came in casually, strutting with Ivern and
Yeah, that one was
filling that away.
that one was
And then
weird.
there was also another game even during their win versus SKT where they had a huge lead from Lucian, but they just tried to skirmish too much and gave opportunities for SKT to kind of claw their way back and gain some gold. Though it didn't affect them too much because they were still too far ahead for SKT to climb a.
Yeah, you mean the game they won, right? Yeah.
Yeah, the second game.
Yeah, they were substantially ahead, and then they started giving up some kills, which they.
Yeah, I think they got aced, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, it was something like that. Like mid game was very hectic, and they lost part of their gold lead, but they had already snowballed pretty decently to the point where they were fine. But yeah, like the game that really strikes me the most from their three losses, obviously, is the TSM one, because they didn't execute and they had a comp that they usually know how to run.
Yeah.
So
Well,
that
like it's good that it was only one game early on during the tournament, and then that they recovered from that.
yeah.
I just want them to be a little more tempered in the mid game, because some of these teams that like to play scaling, or a good team like SKT that are really great in the mid game and punishing overeager opponents, you can't do that versus them.
Yeah.
You need to be more tempered in your playstyle.
Yeah, I feel like that's. I was rewatching their other loss that wasn't the SKT game, so that was the Marines game, and that was a game that was like a bit weird to watch as well, where they were. It's like the game just blew wide open right from the beginning, and then they just kept falling behind from overaggression. So
Yep.
yeah, it definitely ties into what you said, where they go too trigger happy in some of their skirmishes and tend to lose more than what they win. And that's not the patient team we keep hearing of, right? I don't follow LPL like super closely, but that's what any expert would tell you, is that they're usually much more patient, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that closes for WE. Just to close, I was gonna say that yeah, they exceeded my expectations as well. I had them as top 4. I think they were a lock for the, well, not a lock actually. I thought they would be third, fourth. There was an off chance that maybe they would be fifth, but I was pretty convinced they'd make top 4, but I was not expecting top 2. So
Yeah.
pleasant surprise for sure. So yeah, from pleasant surprises we go to expected results, at least from us. Even though criticism has been pretty harsh. So from here we segue on to TSM, and we both had them. I believe we both had them fifth, right? We said there was an off chance they could get top 4, but the expected.
Yeah, it depended on a lot of good things to happen for TSM.
Yeah, that didn't happen. So yeah, so let's talk a bit about, first off, with Draft, because even though I think it's not the only thing, and you mentioned it on Twitter as well, I don't think it's the only thing, and there was a lot of stuff in game that they were definitely missing on. I think Draft is an aspect that's worth covering here.
I mean, I love the draft phase, and I think it's important.
Mm-hmm.
But when you see a mediocre team that has consistent mediocre performances, it can't be the draft. The draft is the last thing you worry about. You have to look at the play, because even when they're ahead or they're behind, they don't play the way the game should be played. And if you are a good team, you're gonna be able to carry mediocre or bad drafts.
Yeah,
and that's what you see good teams do. And yeah, just frankly, that TSM should not be relying on drafts to, like, you can't outdraft the opponent every game. Like, even the best teams like SKT, they don't get the best draft every game. So you can't expect TSM, you can't expect from any coach to win like
every draft.
a large majority of drafts, because you're gonna get side differences. They're gonna be surprise picks. The other team also has like a drafter that can find like a good strategy to beat your draft.
Mm-hmm.
But like in terms of TSM, like did they actually have a lot of like was their drafting the worst during this tournament?
I was gonna say that I don't feel like their draft was that problematic. I might be wrong, but I mean, like
I feel like at least 50% of their drafts were fine.
At least, yeah, sure. I mean,
the only thing I can like knock on Parth or the team on is okay. So people often forget that there are two phases to the pick ban, and there's bans and there's pick. You can have sometimes you can have a really great meta compositions, but bad bans because you let a comfort champ through or you didn't account for a counter that can hurt your composition.
Yeah.
And so I think for TSM, it was the bans that hurt them the most, and less so the compositions, because I feel like a lot of their compositions were like mediocre to solid, sometimes really good.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that sometimes they let through bans like Stark's Gragas, Slay's Ziggs, banning out champions that Betty doesn't play.
Yeah.
So I feel like a lot of the blame should be shifted towards the bans rather than the drafts themselves.
Mm-hmm.
But even then, it shouldn't be like bans shouldn't be enough to make your team like bad bans shouldn't be enough to make your team mediocre.
Yeah,
you are mediocre. You are mediocre. You are bad.
Yeah. We can look at some of these drafts. I'll open them here. I think I have all the TSM ones. Give me just a sec before I change screen. Yeah, right here, courtesy of Esports Wikis. If you don't use their website, you should. Yeah, the ones that really strike me are obviously the first game against Marines, where they just lose their opening game after they just faced them in a BO5. So they should be very aware that one of Stark's only comfort champions is Gragas. And then I think, I think the rest is like. This is one of the examples where they let him have the Gragas, and then most of that game was actually execution with the top lane dives, just giving him a free laning phase and getting him ahead, right? So apart from that Gragas pick, I thought that game was mostly execution with that first gank top lane, and then the other one that kind of strikes is, as you mentioned, the two bans against Betty, the Kog'Maw Twitch bans here. Also in the Marines game, they went for to protect the Twitch comp kind of, which is very uncharacteristic of TSM with Double Lift, with Wild Turtle.
You can say like that's a game where like it's a good draft, but maybe not for them.
Yeah, exactly.
And it wasn't Turtle's fault they lost this game. It was, as you said, like the top shenanigans that happened.
Yeah. Like we on Twitter, everyone and myself including, were memeing Turtle, but honestly, like. The execution was bad. In team fights, there was not enough peel for him in some situations where he was just getting killed. So I feel like the two drafts that really stand out for me is the first against Marines, and the last one against Flash Wolves. I mean, I still remember there's this draft they have against. It's one of the games against SKT. I think it's either that one. Yeah, I think it's the second game against SKT. Where I feel like they actually got a pretty good draft overall. SKT did flex the Fizz, but like they had mid priority. Bjergsen was actually punishing Faker super hard in mid lane, and that's a game where I feel like the draft was pretty solid from them. And maybe if it's not SKT, if it's another team, they can beat them.
Yeah, the problem is that their early game is actually pretty mediocre. Like on a scale of 1 to 10, it's usually a 5.
Yeah.
And sometimes if Bjergsen gets mid lane priority, it goes up to like a 7. But they don't punish as hard as they used to back domestically in summer last year. And we saw that when they went to Worlds. Even with Double Lift, their early games are actually not that great. They don't get these ginormous early game leads. And I feel like that's mostly because they are not comfortable with playing off. Like they rely too much on mid lane priority to be able to do things. And also, even if they do have mid lane priority, they need Hanser to overperform and get really ahead, either through ganks or on his own, to really be able to get a huge gold lead and snowball that.
Yeah. And then the other problem that it kind of dissipated throughout the tournament was one thing we've harped on about endlessly. I wanted to show my video, but my co-host wouldn't allow me. But I'll link it in the description somewhere, which is Sven Skjern's very unusual and pretty bad invades, right? Where he invades constantly without his lane pressure. And I feel like, one, we talked about this already, he was punished in NALCS more than enough times to know what to do and how to not repeat this. And I feel like games where they actually did well was like, for example, games where Bjergsen and Hanser have both lane priority. When they have pushing mid and top was when I noticed that Sven can actually go for those really aggro invades, and he doesn't get punished, and they start snowballing off of that as well. But when they don't get that, he still does it, and he gets punished.
And sometimes he does it even if they do get priority. Like like their lanes have priority, but he doesn't do it at the exact time when the lane is pushed. And also on top of that, I do want to like commend him because in the last 2 days, I don't think there was one invade that he did bad. Maybe there was one in their last game.
There was one like 17 minutes in against Flash Wolves, but that was it.
But more or less, it got a lot better, improved, and like props to him for at least realizing how bad it was midway.
Yeah, I think his play leading up to the second half, I think it got much better in that regard.
Yeah, and back to like their play style, like their early game is like mediocre, but their mid and late game is really bad. It's almost non-existent for a top team, like a team that's been at the top of LCS and their region for like the past year. They do not know how to control their side waves to create pressure and rotate in order to get towers or break the base. They don't know how to take vision, especially after taking objectives. You'll see multiple times the enemy team being able to sneak Baron because TSM has bad backs and bad vision to be able to spot the enemy team going to Baron.
Yeah, they don't stagger their backs as well in some situations. Like, I can't remember the exact game because there were so many games, but there was a game where the enemy team just legit, I think, was it G2? Yeah, it was G2. G2 just sneaks a Baron because they all back at the same time.
Yeah. And
they just leave the map open. They just leave the map open, and G2's like, "Oh shit, free Baron!" And then they all flash over the wall. It's like
you can do it once, and okay, that's unforgivable, but okay. Then you do it twice in the same game, and then a third time in the game you play at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And it's like, what is going on?
Yeah.
And yeah, like off of that, their Baron control is really bad. They don't know how to secure red side vision. Or blue side vision in order to control Baron and bait the enemy team into overextending and creating a pick.
Yeah, and this was a thing that I remember Misfits actually did pretty well, like midway through the season, like before they started like losing more games. Like one thing they're actually pretty good was like the Baron baits, because it's like a really good aspect when you're ahead. If you can bait Baron and keep vision around it and keep forcing the enemy to poke around for information, you can eventually get a catch. And even if that doesn't lead to Baron, it's still going to lead to something, right? If you have good control. I feel like it's super easy to do when you're ahead, especially like TSM that were really ahead in those games. Yeah.
Like upward of 5k gold. Like it should be super easy for you to bait Baron and create picks.
Yeah, one of my friends on Discord renamed to TSM Blue an 8k gold lead. So it was that bad. But yeah, I didn't actually look into sidewaves a lot in their games, but I don't remember them being good, like in the sense that it ties a bit into Baron, where if you're playing around Baron and your wave is pushing bot lane, you might be getting some advantages there, right? And even their lane assignments in some situations, I feel like I feel like what they do is they just push their wave. And then wait for the wave to bounce back and push it again. They're not aggressive when the enemy has to catch the waves. Yeah,
I think that's the problem.
And I mean, that's fine to do. Like, pushing the wave and waiting for it to bounce back is fine if you're looking to... So if you're looking to push, roam, and use that time until the wave has to be pushed back and wait for a reaction, right? And use the numbers advantage, that's fine, but they don't do that either, right? So they end up not punishing the catch, like punishing the person who's catching the wave, or using the man advantage to force somewhere else. And yeah, some of their lane assignments sometimes were a bit iffy as well, I feel. Where they could have done more if they had allocated correct amount of people to each lane.
Yeah. I think their lane assignments might become better with double lift.
Okay.
But it's only going to be in the aspect where they're able to accumulate a larger CS lead. I don't think, like back when they did have double lift at Worlds, they still weren't able to use the side wave in order to create, a pick, in order to be like aggressive with the pressure that they had.
Wait, so do you actually think it's going to be better with double lift, knowing that last time we saw double lift play, which was Worlds, we saw a big mistake, which is when you have an AD carry, you mostly want to put him in the mid lane, unless he's like a side lane AD carry that wants to split, but like he got caught over and over in side lane. So do you think their lane assignments will improve with him?
Well, their lane assignments are good outside of the fact that sometimes it gets caught, and it kind of got better throughout the tournament. But I think the team will maybe be a bit more dominant in NA, but they're still going to have the same problems. And if they get into a tough group with, say, any of the Korean teams plus like a good Chinese team, or maybe even versus G2, they might run into more problems. And I think mostly it's because they're a bit too stoic. You really like what they're gonna do. They have one play style and they stick to it. And if you can play around it in the mid game and the late game, then they're stumped.
Yeah, and we saw that in the games against G2 where they could. Basically, even in the game they won against G2, it was very close, right? And it shouldn't have been nearly as close because G2 was really behind. So yeah, they really become predictable in the late game, and they leave a lot of space for teams to come back into the game. But I think that pretty much says it for TSM. We should move on because we have 3 teams still in that we need to look at for the top 4, right? But before that, let's talk a bit about Gigabyte. Yeah, I keep reading GAM, and it just like my head wants to. I'm gonna say Germania Bears, but it's Gigabyte Marines. Anyway, so tell me what did you think of Gigabyte Marines?
Man, this team is nuts, but I think they're terrible.
Okay.
I think Levy's good, or Levi is good, and the rest of the team not so much. Even Optimus, I think he's really inconsistent and has a shallow champ pool, and the other players are really, really bad unless they get like their comfort picks, like Stark on Gragas or Slay on Ziggs.
Yeah.
And I just feel like they're too similar to the other wildcard upset team that we had in our last Riot International event, which was last Worlds, and that was Albus Nox. If you remember, they came out swinging at the start of the group stage, and then later on, people started to figure them out. They started having a tougher time, and in the end, in the quarters, they just get demolished by H2K.
Yeah.
And I feel like there's a commonality, which is people don't research these teams, or there's just not enough information about these teams, and they're too obscure, or they rely too much on non-standard play like lane swaps or non-standard picks like Ziggs, and then people just don't know their comfort picks. They don't know their style. They don't know, for example, like I said, the lane swap strat. So I feel like those teams just had a lot of surprise factors, and that's why they were able to net so many wins.
Yeah, they rely on these crutches, right? And I think the BO1 system is definitely something that benefits these teams a lot, right?
Yeah, and like, let's talk about this, because I don't think getting an early lead is that impressive, especially since we swapped to a standard lane meta.
Yeah. It's very
like since they killed off lane swaps, any team can get a gold lead versus any team. in the first 15 minutes. Like you can have a cheesy strat at level 1, or uh, get off a gank because the enemy mid laner wasn't paying attention or was being cocky and overstepped.
Or you got like a good level 1 invade, figured out the enemy jungler,
Yeah,
and
or
managed to
even
get
like,
the first gank off.
or even you get like good lane matchups from draft, and that allows you to play the early game a lot easier.
Yeah.
And honestly, it's how teams play in the mid and late game that differentiates the good from the bad. And despite how nuts the Marines were in the early game, they still ended up last place in groups because they just rely too many on their gimmicks and they don't consistently work. And their mid game and late game is almost non-existent. It's even worse than TSM's.
Yeah. But I would say that something that is commendable about them is that they came in, they didn't try to play the standard style, you know? They played what they were good at, and I think that ties a bit into the discussion that I think I'd rather have a team that like play the style they're good at than try to play a style that they cannot play 100%.
Yeah, of course. Of course. Like, I'm not knocking them down for their style.
Yeah.
It's just the truth of the matter that they're bad.
Yeah. But I liked like their comps with like the zigs,
Yeah.
the zig Z thing, and then they
Yeah,
had a
they're
really
fun to watch.
Yeah, for sure.
They're fun to watch. They have a lot of gimmicks, and people love that. But in the end, that's not going to cut it versus good teams, and especially versus some bad ones like TSM.
Yeah. But yeah, like they had like pretty interesting dive comps. I think Levi, we might see him in another region. Do you think we'll see him in China perhaps? Since
there is a bit of friction between China and Taiwanese players, so you don't really see
wait, but
them.
he's Vietnamese.
Vietnamese players, sorry, my bad. And also Taiwan, like
Yeah, mainly
those,
Taiwanese, but yeah, but with
like
Vietnamese
those
as well.
those Mandarin speaking regions. It's really hard for them to get imported because of various political and non-political reasons. And also I heard that Vietnam has like a really good esports scene that's like really flourished, and
Okay.
so it might not be enough to be able to lure these players. And also you have to also remember like the English factor is really important. I don't think Levi speaks English, but that can also really impact his style because he's so used to playing on a team that speaks his own language, and that might be a reason as to why he pops off so often.
Yeah, okay.
But he is a really good player. Like I would need to see him in another region or like in more international tournaments, but he was pretty good here.
Yeah, I think not just mechanically, but he understood how to path and how to punish other junglers as well, and like he understood one thing that we sometimes don't see from junglers in main regions, which is correctly assessing what lanes you need to gank and what lanes have kill pressure, right? And I think that as basic as that may seem, just that and the way he tracked and punished other junglers was pretty good overall, and very, I'd say almost never seen from a wildcard team.
Yeah, like if they didn't have a jungler that's as smart and as cerebral as he was in the early game, they would have done a lot worse.
So do you think, to finish this one out, do you think they're a better team than ANX? Who do you think is the best wildcard team we've seen, performance-wise?
I feel like ANX had a bit more of a consistent mid game, and kind of knew how to play around Baron.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think Gigabyte's Marines would demolish them in the early game so hard that ANX doesn't have like good enough mid game like or late game to be able to claw their way back.
Okay.
Unless Gan made so many stupid mistakes.
Yeah. Okay, that's fair. So I think that cuts it for GAM. Pretty good performances from them. Honestly, very very fun to see. I think it's, even though the format does benefit them, I feel like it's very nice that we're having now these teams instead of the teams that just go to international events and roll over and die 0-6, 1-5, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, they make teams sweat, and that's good to see.
Yeah. Okay, so three playoff teams remaining. I believe we want to move on to G2, who miraculously made it when it was looking pretty bad. I think it's worth mentioning that mainly Sven and I think Perks have been the shining stars in terms of mechanical performance. Although G2 just released that clip today about Expect calling that last fight against TSM. But yeah, I'll leave it to you to start. What are your frustrations with this team, watching them in the international stage, especially for this tournament?
This team, man. Look, I respect the organization and I respect the players, but I really don't respect their play style.
Okay.
I want to make an analogy. So in European football or soccer, for you Westerners, you have teams that they're not very good or don't know how to play offense. They basically park the bus, which means they play super defensively, play in their own half of the field, and never really attempt to go forward because they hope that the enemy team just can't score and the game ends in a draw, or they just find this one. Yeah, and they have like this one opportunity where they can go forward and steal a win with one chance, one goal.
Mm-hmm.
And no one really respects these teams because it shows they're not good. It's boring, and it doesn't work as good teams most of the time. Like these sorts of teams that park the bus end up mid-table or at the lower end of the table.
Mm-hmm.
And G2 is exactly like this team that parks the bus. They don't want to play offense by picking early game drafts, because if they do, they're going to screw it up and the game will be over in 30 minutes. So what they want to do is park the bus. They pick scaling lanes, these protect ADC comps with a lot of wave clear, Orianna, Caitlyn, and then they just play back. They let the enemy take everything, and in the early game they don't do it consciously. They're not like, just take everything. We want to play bad in the early game. It's just that they've forfeited the early game through this draft, and they don't have the pressure, they don't have the priority to do much. And if the enemy team is good enough and has a smart understanding of how to use priority, they're going to get a huge gold lead.
Mm-hmm.
But at this event, there were teams that aren't that great at closing off games. Teams like GAM or TSM. So what G2 hopes,
or even Flash Wolves, their game versus G2, it was a
they didn't know how to deal with the Ivern.
Yeah, and they didn't know how to play the LeBlanc for split push. Maple played a really good LeBlanc, but it just doesn't work against that comp, because against that comp, especially with the LeBlanc, you should have gone with the build like the Lichbane Gunblade build and split them, because if you're like, he was actually putting, his combos were so good, but you're playing against 3 shields and he could never kill that Caitlyn. I think it was Caitlyn. So yeah, I think a lot of teams don't understand how to close. Yeah, go on.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And that worked for G2's benefit, because they would just reach 40 minutes because they had enough wave clear, and the enemy team didn't know how to use pressure to get Baron and then use Baron to break open the base. And so they reach 40 minutes and hope to reach 40 minutes, and when they do get there, gold becomes more even, and then they can win fights.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I wouldn't be knocking them down so much if it wasn't for the fact that they're not good in the mid to late game, which is like the 20 to 40 minutes.
Yeah.
They're not implementing a strategy. They're just waiting for the game to get. It's like complexity, from back in season 4.
Oh man,
that would just wait to 80 minutes with Tristana and I forgot what, Ziggs, Ziggs and Tristana and stuff. And that team wasn't considered good. But G2 has better mechanical players, better individuals, so they can overcome other teams in their domestic league. But it's similar to complexity. There's no macro involved other than just waiting, scaling, hoping the other team is stupid enough, and then it's 40 minutes and the game's even. Let's fight.
Okay.
And one more thing is, one of their coaches, I think is Weldon, that talked about they want to beat SKT. They want to be able to be like the best team or one of the best teams in the 20 to 40 mark, the mid to late game.
Yeah.
And they trained all split to be this great team in the mid game. But that didn't happen. They just wait for the 40-minute mark. And it's just like having one of the best teams or like the best team in your region play that way in an international event to claw wins versus these bad teams like Flash Wolves and TSM. It's just really disappointing and, to be honest, a bit embarrassing.
Okay. I wanted to ask you one thing though. I recall that their first game was versus SKT, right? And in that first game, they actually had a pretty good early. Again, we talked about SKT not having exactly the best early game in the world. It's not really their strength, but I remember distinctively that even though Renekton didn't get good advantages against the Galio, and maybe if they had Igragas, they would have more scaling elements that would allow them to play better during mid game. I think they had a pretty solid early game, right? And then they have that Rift Herald call that just fucks their game up because they lose 2 towers bot lane or something, and they lose a fight.
Yeah.
So do you think it's the case where they go into the first game, they try to play early, geared towards early game, it doesn't work out, so they just think like, okay, boys, we're back into scaling comps because this is not going to work. Do you think that's a thing?
Yeah, maybe, and like they shouldn't think that because they were playing versus SKT. SKT, they're never really behind unless the enemy team is like 8k gold up and they have a Baron.
Yeah.
Seriously, watch SKT games when they're behind. Even when they're 3 to 5k gold down, it feels like they can still win team fights or like most of the team fights. So you really like versus SKT. We'll get to this later about like SKT's weaknesses and how to beat them.
But yeah, just to show draft on screen real quick. This is their draft, as you can see. It's Ashe, Lee Sin, Zyra, Renekton, Orianna. It's very early game focused, right? Renekton, even though I feel like he didn't get enough advantages, I think because of the caliber of players. Not to diss on Expect, but I think Uni's on another level. But yeah, most of their draft is like Ashe, Zyra, pretty good catch, good level 6. Lee Sin, Orianna can hold the Syndra. They had a pretty good early game comp and they executed it pretty well. And then since it didn't
until
work
the
out,
mid game hit.
Yeah, until the mid game hit, and they had that. I don't even know like that Herald thing. Like, have they been practicing on 7.9? Because like they did that Herald thing twice. It was this game and it was another game where they just randomly try to go for Herald. Maybe because they feel like they need it on Renekton, so Renekton can actually punish Galio in the split, but like they just lost too much. So I feel like they went into this game, early game didn't work, and then they were like, okay, we're back to scaling. It just feels like that for me.
Is it just that game? Because they have scrims too, and I feel like
sure.
Their early game, like we also know. Back in EU, their early games were a lot slow, like really slow.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm assuming like scrims also went that way, where their early games are slow when they play these early game comps, and they didn't snowball them well in the mid game versus these teams.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is probably why they ended up going for so much of these late game scaling comps.
All right.
And like I feel like if you feel like I'm knocking them off so hard, I think the players and a lot of experts feel that way too. There was a Mithy interview, I think, with Yahoo, and he said like it's a bit embarrassing how we got here, and it's kind of a relief that we did though. So I hope in this 1 week they're able to fix some of the holes in their early game.
Yeah.
But we'll get into the WE.
But
matchup later.
Yeah, but I was today I was watching G2 versus Flash Wolves because it was the one game from G2 I didn't watch. So I watched it real quick, and it was it was pretty clean snowball from them. Sure, they used the Graves level 3 cheese with the the XP quint, but overall, like, it was a game where they understood, like, they had a good matchup for sure. Like Flash Wolves with the blind Kled was pretty weird,
Yeah, like their comp was still
And
late game focus with the Twitch, Shen, and Orianna, but the Flash Wolves just picked a worse comp with Blinding Kled, Jin pick, Vladimir into Orianna, which is terrible.
yeah, yeah.
So I think the game was a bit handed to them, and it snowballed really well through that early game non-standard path.
Yeah, but this was a kind of game where they actually snowballed from early, even though like their comp is like not super early game focused. I feel like they actually executed early really well, and they kept snowballing. Now, if that was just Flash was just giving them too many advantages.
Yeah, and you can't win all games with these gimmick paths,
Yeah, for sure.
You have to learn how to play with priority.
Yeah, for sure. But it was a game where from the draft point of view, I think they did pretty well in shutting down Maple and shutting down his mid priority. They banned his LeBlanc Syndra, immediately took the Ori. Like, sure, he could have picked mid lane. He could have picked mid lane instead of that Kled, right?
Could have picked Talia or Ari.
Or or even Rise. Just
so
straight up.
I honestly think it was Flash Wolves were still in their terrible. We don't know how to play mid priority phase.
Okay, that's fair. But yeah, overall, very very scaling. Very scaling oriented comps from G2. I think even in terms of individual performance, we don't really touch on this that much, but individually, like micro speaking, like Trick has looked, even on Nunu, abysmal, like to the point where he just like fucks up with Nunu, who's a pretty basic champion, right? Like that game against Ivern, like him just getting stolen, cam stolen, where like what's the point of the pick? It kind of loses a bit of purpose aside from consuming Daisy, which is obviously a bit of a meme.
Honestly, I don't want to go into too deep into like their draft decisions. I think we covered enough about like why these draft decisions were wrong in like an overview.
Yeah, I think that's fair. So we'll look forward to them. We'll look at them again when we preview their matchup. So next up, Flash Wolves, and this was a team that I got a bit of flame for their performances because we did say they have the best early game in the world, and they go into MSI with like horrible games, and they were at a point where they were almost out, right?
Yep.
Just like G2, like TSM in the last week had a pretty good chance of getting out over Flash Wolves and G2, either one. So, what happened? We know like a big part of this is draft, actually, right?
A bit of both. Well, let's start here. So, there's this misconception that this team only had great early games domestically. This is completely wrong.
Yeah, it's not true at all.
It's not true. They had 2 international events, Worlds versus teams like SKT, C9, and IME, and then at IEM recently in Katowice, where they had good early games versus HDK, Unicorns, and G2.
Yeah, I have the numbers here, actually.
So looking at that, and then also looking at their domestic data, plus they had perceived roster upgrade in the ADC position, everyone, all the experts had them at number 2, had them at like, maybe not the best early game in the world, but one of the best at least.
Yeah.
And they were highly praised for it. And so it was really disappointing to not only me, but a lot of experts and a lot of Flash Wolves fans that like their playstyle about how this team entered MSI. And we touched upon this earlier when we were talking about Team WE, that WE and Marines were one of the only two non-Korean teams that kind of knew what the meta was and that it's still mid-priority.
Yeah.
So like coming into this event, they had a wrong read on the draft. I don't know why. Maybe they played G2 so much, and G2 played a lot of Ivern, Nunu, Kog'Maw, Twitch, Caitlyn.
Okay.
And so they move away from the playstyle that has been so successful for them at multiple international events and domestically, and they end up focusing on bot lane and giving mid lane scaling matchups. When traditionally they play best when they have this pushing mid lane, and then one of the side lanes has a good counter matchup or has a good matchup, and then Karsa has the ability to use the pressure from his mid especially, and use Sword Art as a tool to help invade the enemy jungle, maybe even gank mid lane, steal some enemy camps, get some vision, and we saw none of that in the first half of the group stage, except one game versus G2 where they did end up having an early game draft.
Yeah, I mean we can go over drafts, but it's not really. I mean the just to look real quick, right? That their first game against WE is like they just go the Rumble, the Rise versus the Talia, which is fine in terms of lane. It's like one of the matchups you can do decently into the Talia.
Yeah, like you can farm.
Yeah, you
fine.
can farm, but you don't have priority. Yeah.
Talia's gonna super roam, and Rise doesn't really scale until he hits like 3 items. I mean, it doesn't really hit a power spike until he hits three items.
Yeah, and then this one against Marines, which they actually won, but they have like Rise Shen with a farming jungle, like.
Yeah, took a lot of mistakes from Marines, I think, for them to win that game.
Yeah, that game specifically. Yeah, so they had a lot of games. Again, I think this might be the team that picked the most games of Rise, right? I think they might just be. I haven't checked, but I think so. Like again against TSM with the Rise, they even went with the Jhin. Like Tom Kench is like, we yield bot lane. It's like you're gonna be under tower that matchup all game because your support doesn't contribute to wave push at all aside from some Targon procs, and then Jhin is like, ever since like. He used to be like dominant in lane because he had so much early game damage, right? But ever since the changes and the nerfs, like he's not that champion that you go into lane with a Tom Kench and say like, we're gonna push. No, you're not. You're gonna get pushed in every matchup, even against like Varus Braum. Like it doesn't matter. So like they had a lot of these lanes against like again, Tom Kench Twitch. You know, with the Nautilus against this game against SKT, the one they lost was like. So weird for me to watch, right? Because it didn't look like Flash Wolves at all. It was, they just like slowly bled out. That was their game plan.
Let's get counter-picked in every lane. Ooh,
yeah,
let's pick Nautilus versus Fiora. Like I used to be Nautilus main, and when I picked Nautilus first time versus Fiora when she got reworked, I wanted to kill myself.
Yeah, you wanted
because
to
that matchup is like one of the worst.
Yeah. But yeah, that game was like. Holy, like if you remove the nameplates, I would never say that game was Flash Wolves game. Like it didn't look like a Flash Wolves game at all. You know, like just yielding pressure from all 3 lanes, farming jungler, just so uncharacteristic. But they did pick it up towards the end of the towards the end of the tournament,
weird
right?
Because it coincided with a weird interview too. Like Betty had an interview with Yahoo, and he was like, "We're just not really good in this meta," and I'm like. Wait, what meta? He's like, he talks about like the scaling meta, like teams are playing scaling and we don't really know how to play that. So I'm like, dude, the meta is not scaling. The meta did not change. You're doing something wrong. You're drafting wrong. You're not playing towards your strengths. Look at SKT. Look at WE. They're not playing super scaling.
Yeah.
They're playing with mid priority. They're playing with 2 winning lanes. They're playing with invading, using vision. In the early game to accumulate these leads, and the day after that interview, their drafts changed completely. They went back to prioritizing stuff like Syndra. What else did they play?
They played. So you're talking about the game they won against SKT, right? I think it was day 4.
I mean, even before that, they started picking.
Yeah, even before that. I mean, not here and.
Not okay. Then
maybe
it was
it was day 4.
Okay,
it was day 4 when they actually went for the Ashe Karma bot lane, so pushing bot lane, again with the Syndra pick, and this alone.
Let's break down this draft step by step. So, I think this is one of the best prepared drafts. At MSI.
Mm-hmm.
And that's ironic because Flash Wolves were drafting horribly before that.
Okay.
So let's see what they do. They take throughout this draft. You're going to see Flash Wolves take advantage of SKT's hubris. So we know that Huni is one of the best rumbles in the world. People might even say the best. And if it's open, he's going to pick it. He doesn't care if there are counter picks. He's going to go for that champion because he's really good at it. He's really good at getting early game priority and then really good at team fighting and TPing with it.
Yeah.
And so Flash Wolves left it open. They took the Karma, and Lulu was banned, so they got the best support in the meta. They got the best support in the meta outside of Lulu. And then they give SKT Rumble and Graves. And it's like, it's fine. Like, Graves is really strong, but Lee Sin can match up with him really well, especially if you're a good jungler like Karsa. And then they take the Fizz as sort of like, maybe it's a flex, but it's probably going to be a counter to the Rumble. Now, Fizz isn't really a hard counter. Yeah?
I was just going to say, what this Fizz pick does right here, right before we go into second bans and the rest, is like, it kind of impedes SKT. Like, if you're SKT, even though, like, if you pick Syndra, like, sure, Faker's going to dominate early, but, like, we've seen that the Fizz is a pretty good pick mid lane against the Syndra, and it's been flexed multiple times against that Syndra, and I feel like it was kind of a thing that impeded the Syndra pick, because you know that that Fizz can be flexed into mid lane.
Yeah, like, they pick the Fizz early because it can counter Rumble, and it can also counter the other champion that SKT Faker was really good on, which is the Syndra. And then they can flex the Fizz mid and get another counter for top lane.
Yeah.
And then, SKT take Nami, which has a good lane matchup versus Karma, but can't really, doesn't really do as much as Karma outside of the lane.
Mm-hmm.
And then you see the bans, Ezreal, because they don't want Bang on a really good scaling carry like Ezreal, and they banned the Twitch earlier. And then they banned the Echo, which is another counter to Syndra.
Syndra, yeah.
Yeah. So what they did here is that because they banned this Echo, SKT definitely can't go Syndra in the first pick in the second round, because if they go Syndra,
the Fizz goes mid.
Yeah, because the Fizz got picked already by Flash Wolves, and if they pick Syndra here, the Fizz is going to go mid. And so when you take Echo out and you take Fizz out, what's left for mid lane?
He can't really go Talia, so he has to default for the Ori, so he can survive lane.
Yeah, and you can say that he could go for the Talia, but I don't think Faker plays that much Talia.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're just like, we'll just try to counter their mid champion. And so Flash Wolves takes Ashe and Syndra, and then SKT is like, we'll just go Orianna because we're confident we're not going to lose the early game that hard, and even if we do, we have a good scaling comp. Well, not completely scaling, but they have like a good comp, Orianna comp, that they can scale with in the mid game if they're not that far behind.
Yeah, sure. And like the Ashe pick as well, I think ties a lot into early game, because one obviously has the initiation from level 6, but the other thing that I feel like some viewers might not look at the Ashe pick and say, wow, this is really important for early game, is the hawk shot, right? Because you can get so much info early game, and tracking a jungler like Peanut is very important, right? So with a hawk shot, you get a lot of that control early game, and that ties into a lot of your laning prowess, because they have a lot of power in their lanes, right? Fizz is going to get pushed in by Rumble early, but then post 6 he has a lot of control. And then Syndra obviously has control over the Orianna, and Karma Ashe versus Nami Varus, I think it's pretty balanced, but I think Karma outpushes, right? Because it's Karma.
Yeah, maybe in the early levels, but considering Flash Wolves bot lane, how bad they are, and how Nami cannot sustain. SKT had to push this game.
But it's more or less matched in theory, right? So
yeah.
But the Ashe in itself, like the pick with the hawk shot, allowing to tracking the Graves is pretty important, I feel.
Mm-hmm.
So I agree. This was one of the better drafts from Flash Wolves. And then if we look from there, even though they lost this game, sure they still went for more early game stuff. They kind of got rolled by the Kled. They got rolled by Kled twice in this tournament by WE. But then we go into their last game against TSM, right? And again, it was another game where they really understood their strengths. Again, the Lee Sin pick with the Talia, very good mid control, and Talia can roam to the sides. Fizz against Shen, which is pretty good for Fizz overall, and Lulu Ashe can hold their own, and the Ashe again can track, so pretty good for early game. So they started drafting much more early game, and we saw the results. Especially this game against TSM was very dominant from the get-go.
The only problem is that, as you said, even if now, okay, so now they understand the draft and they understood the meta.
Mm-hmm.
Even then, they can't rely on their bot lane at all. Even when they get good matchups, they've been getting rolled over. They're the second worst bot lane in the tournament. So right now, they really rely on getting a good mid matchup, but also getting a comfortable matchup for MMD, sorry, and playing off of him as well.
Wait, when you say second worst bot lane, do you mean that from the 4 teams left, or of the 6? Like, were they worse than? Do you think they were worse than Biofrost and Turtle?
Yeah, completely. Okay. They're completely worse, at least in lane.
Okay. So you're talking strictly in lane. Okay, that's fair. So yeah,
but
I think
it also, like, I want to stress that it's not just draft that made them look better, but because they got these drafts, they were able to play a lot more towards their playstyle of pushing mid and then Karsa and Sword Art roaming and getting vision, creating picks, etc.
Yeah, and just Maple having more control over his lane. Obviously, he's one of the players that actually knows really well when he gets an advantage how to make that advantage bleed into side lanes. And we saw that on the Taliyah, we saw that on the Syndra. I hope if we saw that on the LeBlanc against Marines, but I hope if we see his LeBlanc again, and if it gets to the point where it needs to split, I hope he understands that and doesn't go for what he did against G2 with the team fight build, because there's no way you win against a team fight an AD carry centric comp with the generic LeBlanc build. You need to split. But yeah, I think it's pretty good that they regained form towards the end, because it's going to be much more interesting for semis. But before we look into semis, we should talk a bit about SKT. And I believe there's not much to talk about based on what we already had said from last week, but we do want to talk a bit about how do you beat SKT, because they did lose 2 games. So
yeah. Like, in terms of strengths, I think everyone knows by now, and we've talked about it extensively last week, what SKT is good at. They came into as the best team. They go into brackets as the best team. And before we go into their weaknesses, I want to actually go over how I think SKT slightly improved their early game.
Okay.
Because of Peanut. And I'm not sure if because he's facing weaker jungle opponents, or because he had a shift in mindset, but he focused a lot on gaining an XP lead, an experience lead, instead of just brute forcing ganks. And I think that helped SKT a lot in terms of the early game, and we saw a lot. I don't know if you have the clip up.
Yeah, do you want Flash Wolves or TSM first?
Either one, you choose. But you saw Peanut go for these aggressive level 1 invades and start in the enemy's jungle. And what that does is, it's interesting, because instead of trying to help bad lanes risky lanes by ganking them, he forces the enemy jungler to path in a certain way by starting in their camp. So this one is versus Flash Wolves.
So Peanut is Graves here. I'm going to skip a bit because it's too early. So basically they do the late invade around 1:30, right? So right here.
Yeah, So, can you pause?
Yep.
In the top lane matchup, you have Fizz versus Rumble, and what happens is Rumble is going to perma push early because he has so much intense wave clear, and Fizz almost has none. And so what Karsa wants to do is start bottom side, then go towards top side, and then gank top lane if possible, and snowball that Fizz a lot earlier. Now here, you can continue. We see Peanut and Huni aggressively invade and start the Lee Sin's blue early. And what that does is it forces Lee Sin to jungle vertically. And after he does Raptors, he has to go to the enemy's jungle in blue side and get those camps. Because if he doesn't and goes towards his blue side, he's going to lose a lot of experience and he's going to be behind.
Yeah, this is not about triple buffing. It's about forcing vertical jungling
Yeah.
where.
And because he forces this vertical jungling, Rumble has a super safe early game where he can just push, and not worry about the Lee Sin coming over.
Yeah, Lee Sin even ends up having like a super awkward pathing where he has to do like he does part of Raves and then he has to go to blue, because if he doesn't go to blue here, I guess he's fearing that he might get triple buffed, even though like it's not really Graves' priority. Graves just wants to stay in the top side of the map where he can keep the Rumble safe, right? Because Rumble, as you can see him right now on the map, is pretty pushed up, right? And if we're looking at the timer right now, 2:40, this would be around like add 10 seconds or 20 seconds, and this is the time where Lee Sin can appear top lane if he does like a route like Red Wolves Blue, right? If he does Red Wolves Blue, he's level 3, he shows up top lane level 3 at 3 minutes, and he tries to get the Fizz snowballed. Even if it's not a kill, if you get Rumble's flash, right? If you get Rumble's flash, it's still really important because Fizz can solo kill level 6 if the Rumble has no flash, because he can land the fish and he can all in.
Another thing to note is, like, you might say, yeah, but he can just go to the enemy's blue, get that jungle, and then get level 3 off another camp, and then just gank bot or mid. No, because naturally mid lane and bot lane for Flash Wolves is going to push, because Syndra and Karma with Ashe has stronger early push advantages.
Yeah.
So Peanut and SKT play this perfectly. We don't have to go over the other TSM game, but it's also the same. Yeah, you can, but it's also like another example of how Peanut improved in terms of like these really smart, aggressive level 1 invades, where he forces the enemy jungler to go a certain route, and if that enemy jungler screws up in any way, he's going to punish him really hard. And the added benefit of stopping that jungler ganking a specific lane.
Yeah, so in this case, they obviously invaded early for vision. So again, since they know where Kha'Zix starts, they force him to, I believe, before. I don't know, was Kha'Zix going to start here anyways? So they were just looking for info in this case, right? It's a bit different from the Flash Wolves one, where they were actually forcing him into a path. I think like here they just want the info so they can track.
Lee Sin goes and invades the enemy blue later on.
Oh yeah, true. So if we keep skipping, he's gonna do Wraiths directly into blue, and this again forces Svenskeren to do the vertical jungling, and it comes to the point where Svenskeren wants to keep doing vertical jungling and gets punished for it with the first blood. Okay.
So yeah, I think this really helped improve SKT's early game, and it was really cool to see Peanut step it up to another level at an international event for the first time.
Okay, so that was obviously one of the things SKT has been doing well, and that has really given them the edge in some of these matchups. But shall we move on? Is there anything else we want to talk about before moving on to how to beat them, or?
No, I think we can start talking about that.
Okay, so as you all know, or if you haven't watched all games, SKT dropped 2 games, one to WE and one to Flash Wolves, and I believe you wanted to look into the. Well, we looked into the Flash Wolves game already. It was a lot about draft, but so do you want to look at the WE game, or is it the Flash Wolves still?
We don't really need to bring up a draft.
Yeah.
Or the gameplay, but it's pretty easy to describe, and I think SKT sometimes when they're doing really well, they have this aura of hubris where they're going to change their draft priority slightly or not prepare as well, and they end up getting 1 or 2 lanes where they don't really have good matchups. For example, Ori into Syndra. And when that happens, SKT is on the back foot because they're giving a team like WE, like Flash Wolves, who have good early games when they do have mid priority, and they're able to get a lead versus SKT. And once they do get a lead versus SKT, it's not over there, because as we saw in the first WE game versus SKT, they got a good lead, but then they threw it away by being too trigger happy.
Yeah.
After you look at every game SKT lost. And like I said earlier, even when you have that lead, do not team fight them. Stay away from team fights. What you want to do is control vision. If you look at the Flash Wolves game, after they had a big lead, they went to the top red side for SKT and lit the map with wards. And because of that control, they had full control of Baron, and they also had enough wards to create picks or create a TP play. And that's what they attempted. They kept going for picks, and that's what you have to do versus SKT if you have a lead. You need to keep getting picks over and over until you make enough good picks to get Baron. And once you get Baron, it becomes a lot easier to pressure SKT and to get towers down and break their base.
Not if you're TSM.
Not if, you have like
no, I'm kidding.
The preface is you have to be good, a good team, and you have to know how to close a game. And so, but you know, this still comes in with a caveat, which is SKT has to draft bad. And how likely is that in a best of 5?
I mean, I think it can happen one game, but is it going to happen enough that SKT is going to yield 3 games in draft to like for example, do you think because I think it's a bit in the Flash Wolves game they first picked the Rumble, right? And even though I know that's a really good pick for Huni and he's a really good player with it, isn't there an element of cockiness, would you say, of arrogance or
yeah.
That they can just play they're just confident enough that they can run that into anything and then and not get punished? Because I think that there's an element to that, like with the Rumble pick, where in the Flash Wolves game the WE game they yield a lot of bot lane pressure, right, with the instant Tom Kench Ezreal bot lane after seeing Ashley's.
Yeah, and even then, okay, so let's assume you get 3 bad drafts from SKT. Let's assume that. It's probably not going to happen, but let's assume that.
Okay, worst case scenario.
You need 3 games where you're a good early game team like Flash Wolves and WE to get those leads and then create constant picks over and over so that you have enough pressure and SKT has enough members down that you can take Baron. And then you have to still close the game. And before you have the Baron, you can't team fight. It's hard. And to do that over 3 games. There's a lot of prerequisites that need to be ticked off.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, we can go into the previews, but it's going to be pretty unlikely that happens with SKT because once the bracket stage hits, that's when they're most serious.
Yeah, and when they get most time to adapt mid-draft, mid-series from mistakes, right? I mean, I can see them dropping a game to Flash Wolves, but I don't think like losing a game would ever phase them to the point where they say like they tilted or they just like lost a game and they started like drafting really poorly all series. I don't think that's gonna happen here.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, with that, I think we're pretty much done with SKT. So we should preview the matchups, right? So since we're talking about SKT, and since that's the first matchup, SKT versus Flash Wolves.
Yeah, so, and it basically goes off what I just said.
Yeah, basically.
Flash Wolves needs to hope for these few prerequisites to all hit in at least 3 games in a best of 5 for them to be able to have a chance to win. And also, Flash Wolves has to continue drafting early game comps or comps with strong early priority.
Where would you say, aside from midline, like usually there's like this kind of rule where you want to try to attempt to have two lanes with priority, right? So usually like ideally you want like mid and a side lane. So for Flash Wolves, would you say like I would say from my point of view that you really want to give MMD a good matchup.
Yep.
Because if you don't give MMD a good matchup, I feel like he's going to be rolled, right? We've seen it like when he got the Fizz, if he gets like Fizz versus Rumble, Fizz versus Shen, maybe Kled versus Shen, although he has lost, was it him? I think it was, yeah, he lost that matchup against Expect, actually. But yeah, like, I feel like you really need to get him a good matchup where he can, either has an edge, or it's like a tank versus tank scaling matchup where one tank can't punish the other. Because if you don't give him that matchup, it's just such a weak point, and Huni knows how to play that. Like, the advantage is better when he has a favorable matchup, and if he calls a peanut and they get him rolling, like, they just take over the game, is what I feel. So I feel like aside from Maple getting these like Syndra into Orianna, Talia into Ryze, or Talia into Orianna, that kind of matchups, aside from that, I feel like the other matchup that really needs to have a good, be good from the get-go, from the draft, has to be top lane. Because like in the bot lane, even with favorable matchups, we've seen that Flash Wolves don't get much done. And sometimes being pushed in is good for Flash Wolves, because that brings a window of opportunity for Karsa to come in, right? And gank. We saw that in their, I believe it was in their BO5 against Supermassive, that they had, like, they were getting pushed in by Supermassive's bot lane, and that just opens a window for Karsa to come in, right? So I feel like it's very important for MMD to have a decent matchup where he doesn't get completely steamrolled by Huni, if they want to attempt to win some games.
Yeah. So I think it should be like, I think Flash Wolves can get one good draft and snowball off of a good early game and off of picks to close out a game, but it's really difficult to see them getting more than one win versus an SKT. That's really brutal in a best of 5 series.
Okay, so your prediction is SKT win. What's the score?
3-1. If Flash Wolves are able to take more than one game off, they can redeem themselves for their group stage mishap.
Okay, I'm gonna go with 3-1 as well. I don't see them getting more than one game, but I would love to see that game go the full distance, even though I won't be able to watch it, but I'll watch the VODs.
Yeah, we have to also remember that this is the first time to meet in a best of 5. They've met each other, I think, 6 times in best of 1s, and Flash Wolves has a 4-2 lead. So maybe they can translate that into a best of 5. I think it's the most interesting matchup that SKT, like the trickiest matchup that SKT could get.
Okay. Even with how well WE is playing?
Yeah, WE is also another. But yeah, I think the situations are a bit similar when Flash Wolves are playing at their top game.
Okay. And then we have the other semifinal, which will be on Saturday the 20th, which is WE versus G2. So walk me through this one.
I mean, after the rant I had about G2, so they have about less than a week to prepare for this best of 5 series. Usually, I've talked about this before, but usually a team in a tournament can't really change their playstyle completely. They can cover up holes, they can use draft to boost a strength they have or cover up a weakness they have in their playstyle, but it's almost impossible to have a shift in gameplay. If they do that, that's insane. If they end up doing it, it's insane. Probably not going to happen. And so just analyzing how the two teams played during the group stage, there is no way that if G2 plays a scaling cop consistently versus WE, that WE is going to lose 3 games to G2. Because WE, if you give them that early game, they know how to play with priority, they know how to snowball, and they are certainly really good at the mid and late game because, you know, they also play late game comps. They're familiar with the Kog'Maw comp. So you're trying to beat a team that has a better early game than you, a better mid game than you, and a better late game than you.
Currently, based on current form, yes. I am going to say that if we look at the two losses for WE, first you have the game, the one-off where they have that game against TSM where they have pretty good early game in terms of draft, and they start executing good well, but they kind of get lost towards mid-game, and they end up getting super outscaled because their comp was like no tank, just based on pickoff, and you can't really rely on pickoff once you're like super behind, right? So do you think there's an element there where like WE gets like a good early game composition but doesn't execute it correctly? I know it's like
No,
it's
I
it's
don't
the
think
it's
so.
the it's the one-off game, right? Where they didn't
It's
execute.
it's an anomaly. Like we
Yeah.
haven't seen that from them in the LPO, in the LPL playoffs, and in every other game in the group stage. So there shouldn't be a reason to believe that that would be a consistent problem. That they would do it enough times for G2 to win 3 games off of that.
Okay. And what about in terms of closing? We obviously know that overall they're pretty good, but they've had some, like even their win against SKT, they were a bit shaky mid game where we talked about it already, where
Yeah,
they skirmish a bit and they tend to extend a game way too much when they shouldn't. And
yeah.
do you think this is something that can open a hole for G2 to take advantage of?
Yeah, that's definitely a weakness that WE has, and with the way that G2 are playing scaling comps, there's a way to take advantage of that skirmishing tendency from WE.
Mm-hmm.
So even then, I think the games they played versus G2, they were just too comfortable with the way that G2 was playing
Yeah.
that it didn't really bother them. Like I said, they're already familiar with the way G2 plays because they know how to play that style as well.
Yeah.
Uh, and
And I
so,
think that overall, like in both their games, they instantly banned the Ivern, and I think that's something that we're gonna
yeah,
see for the whole series. I think that we're not gonna see any Ivern in that series because G2 is gonna, WE is gonna ban it every time.
yeah, their drafting is pretty solid most of the time. So, uh, yeah, I mean, okay, so let's think of the other hypothetical where, okay, G2 abandons the late game drafts and goes for early to mid game
Yeah.
priority drafts. I mean, even then, I don't think they're able. It's going to be the same, like similar to SKT. I feel like where they might get an early lead, but they don't know how to play the early to mid game
Well enough.
properly enough and allow WE to scale, then out objective them, out team fight them, etc.
Yeah, and I think to play early to mid game, play like that, and actually snowball effectively, they would need like a really 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 big step up from Trick because he hasn't been looking too hot.
Hmm.
So we need like a really solid performance coming in from him.
Yeah,
Um,
it's
like
stacked against G2 right now.
yeah,
They're going
player
to need a lot of things to change and to go right for them to win this series.
player by player. Where do you think G2 can exploit the most? Player for player. So if we're looking at individual
I
matchups,
I don't think they can exploit any lane.
yeah, okay,
GA and Mystic have had really high, good laning numbers. This tournament, 957. Like maybe they can abuse 957 if they put him in a bad matchup, but even then, G2 doesn't play towards top lane very much.
yeah. Do you think there's any chance like Perks can assert his lane kingdom against GA? I don't think
Yeah,
it's
I
likely,
mean
but if he has
it's
a good
possible
matchup,
if he gets a good matchup. I can see it.
okay. So overall, you're predicting, I guess, a WE win. What's the scoreline?
I want to be cocky with this one and just say 3-0, because I don't want to go for 2-3-1. So, yeah, what the hell? Let's say it's probably going to be a 3-1, but I'm going to say 3-0 just for kicks.
Okay. I mean, this is the kind of game where I don't know. I still don't trust WE enough. I should based on their performances in groups, but it's one of those series where I can see them 3-0ing and I can see them fucking up like momentarily to the point where it goes 5 games.
Use your analysis. Don't use what ifs.
Yeah, it's true. But I think like based on what we looked at, we're looking at a 3-0 or at most a 3-1. But I'm actually gonna go with 3-0. But I really hope that G2 can take some games and show up. For not only for the region, because like the whole fans like anti G2 fans and all that stuff, but
Yeah,
also
like, I want them to succeed. I
yeah,
want them to
I
play well.
actually I want them to win here, but like there's wants and what I think is gonna happen and what I want to happen, right?
Yeah,
That's two very different things.
yeah. The reality of the matter is they're just not playing really well right now, and W is hitting like hot form.
Peak performance. So yeah, I'm gonna go with 3-0. Although, as I said, I really want them to win a game. So I hope G2 prove me wrong. That's the one thing I want to see them do, is prove me wrong. But I'm gonna go with 3-0, and I believe you went with 3-1, correct?
3-0.
Okay, 3-0 as well. Okay, so I think that's pretty much it for this episode. We haven't really decided, we haven't really talked about it, but I think we might do an episode post MSI. Maybe the schedule isn't very good for previewing the finals, because basically, if you're not aware of the schedule, it's Friday, Saturday, Sunday for the games. So there's not really enough time to look at the semifinals before the final, which is unfortunate. But I think MSI has spread so long already. It's been a month almost. So yeah, but we'll see. But that's gonna be it for this episode of the War Room covering MSI. Link in the description to my Svenskeren video because I wasn't allowed to show it here because of my co-host. So
I do not approve of this video.
Yeah,
just so you guys know.
It's 2 BM apparently. But yeah, we hope you guys enjoyed, and we hope to see you either in another episode for MSI or eventually at another international tournament. So yeah, that's going to be it. And yeah, we hope you guys enjoyed it. Peace.